Have you ever been part of a delay? Now picture this for a minute. You get your bags packed and you're ready to go on your trip, and you hop in the taxi or maybe your car and you get to the airport and you get through security, you've got everything together, you get to your terminal and the flight's delayed. And you thought, I had everything prepared, I had my ticket ready, I had my passport ready, and yet I'm stuck waiting. Or let's think about this on the other end. You're up in the air and you're about to land, and all of a sudden you feel the plane just start to turn a little bit, and you bank and you think, what's happening? And all of a sudden you hit what's called the holding pattern. The runway's not ready yet. And you have to just stay up in the air. And that's what a holding pattern is. They actually take the plane and they circle the runway and they just wait for the right moment. Now, can't that happen in our spiritual life?
Yeah, I think we've all experienced that. And that's what we want to talk about here in this session, those holding patterns in our faith, where it just feels like, when are we ever going to touch down? When are we going to move on? When are we going to make progress?
Right.
And that frustration is epitomized in the life of two women of God that the Gospel of John tells us about.
Right.
It's Mary and Martha. They are sisters of Lazarus, and all three of them are partners in Jesus' ministry. They're friends of his. In fact, Jesus spent much time at their house. But Lazarus gets sick. And so Mary and Martha send for Jesus to come. And they're waiting, and he's getting more sick, and Jesus doesn't appear, and he's getting more sick, and Jesus doesn't come, until finally the day comes that Lazarus dies. Jesus never showed. And not only did he not show up in time to heal Lazarus, but he missed the funeral. A day goes by, 2 days go by, 3 days go by. Finally, 4 days later, Jesus arrives. And John just so beautifully pulls us into the tension of the moment as Martha goes running out to meet Jesus, and she falls at his feet, and she's just heartbroken. And then it's not much longer after that Mary comes running out, and she does the same thing. She falls at the feet of Jesus in John 11, verse 42 or 32. And here's what it says. Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him. She fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died."
Wow, that's the same Mary that we actually talked about in a previous session.
That's right.
She's back at his feet again. In the first time we saw her, she was at Jesus's feet and she was pouring perfume on him, and she was commended for her act of worship towards him.
That's so true. And to think about that contrast, here's Mary worshiping God in one moment, and now in this scenario, she's waiting on God.
Right.
And she's frustrated because she's been in this holding pattern of, I know what God can do.
Right.
He just won't do it, and I don't know why.
Right.
Can we just stop before we even go any farther in this story? I just feel like we need to pour some grace on for some of us that are in that place. One of the truths that I see in this story is the fact that you can be devoted to God and disappointed by God.
Yeah, that's true.
It doesn't have to be one or the other. Mary still knows what Jesus can do. If you read the story, she even makes expressions of faith, and she knows that Jesus has the potential to heal Lazarus, and she knows that he's the Lord. But Jesus hasn't done what she wanted him to, and he certainly hasn't done it the way that she wanted him to do it. And so she's devoted, but she's disappointed.
Yeah, and honestly, I've been there as well. We got the news that my wife had gotten breast cancer, and man, that was really heavy for us. But right away, we started believing God for a miracle. We thought, we know what the Lord can do, and we believe that he can take care of this. We didn't know what stage she was at yet or anything, but we just were believing that God would take care of it. Well, long story short, when we get to the hospital and she's being wheeled back for her double mastectomy surgery, and I see her go back, the weight hit, and myself and some of those around me, we felt that disappointment. We felt, I was believing that God was going to bring a miracle. I thought for sure that he was going to show up.
Wow. Yeah, boy, that feeling of, God, what are you up to?
Yeah.
that hits hard on the heart of people that love God. And, as we look forward in the story a little bit, Jesus, comes to the tomb, and he's even caught up in the emotion of everything. I mean, this was his friend Lazarus. And even though much earlier in the story, he had a plan and he had already expressed to his disciples that God was going to be glorified through all this, the Bible says down in verse 35 that Jesus wept.
Wow.
This is an intense emotional season for everyone in the story. And yet, Jesus has them take him to the tomb, and he prays this prayer out loud. He prays to God in verse 41 and 42. He said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me."
Yeah.
And then in verse 42, he says, "I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here."
Wow.
I love that Jesus prayed that way, because it reminds us that sometimes we feel like, God's forgotten because of delay, because of disappointment. It seems like God's not paying attention, or that God missed his opportunity to display God's glory. Jesus articulates right here in this prayer, God, the reason this is happening, the way this is happening, is for the benefit of the people.
Yeah.
God's going to be glorified the most through the story that Jesus is preparing, and the people. And we don't always feel like this, but the reality of God's word is true, that we are going to most benefit if we let our story play out the way that he's leading and guiding the story.
Absolutely. And even in my testimony, in that moment, this story in John 11 is what came rushing into me as I was there in that moment. And I remembered him saying that God would get the glory, that in the end, he would be further glorified to a way that I couldn't even think, ask, or imagine. And isn't it that way in our lives, though, that we're in that waiting period, we're in that holding pattern, but we really have to just double down on who God is, who he says he is, and what he can do. I think of the story in Daniel chapter 3 as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they're not bowing down and worshiping this king, this pagan king. And so they're going to get thrown into this blazing fire.
Right.
So, but before they get thrown into the fire, they say this: "If we are thrown in the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand." So right there, they're saying he is able to do this.
That's faith.
Yeah, like Mary and Martha saying, like, I know what you're capable of, God. But the next verse says, "But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." So they just had that resolve and said, I'm trusting God.
Yeah.
I don't know what it looks like. I know that I'm in a holding pattern, and he hasn't showed up yet in the way that I expect him to show up, but I believe that he's working.
Yeah, and to just have that confidence that God is working is sometimes it's all we have, but it's enough. It reminds me of the promise that we often quote in Romans 8:28. It says, "And we know that in all things God works." Now, there's more to the statement than that, but even if we just put the period right there, that's enough.
Right.
To just know that in my waiting, he is working. In my waiting, God is working. And we know that he works. We don't see that he works. We can't always feel that he works, but we know in all things, God works. But then it goes on to not just say he's working, but that he works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. So while we wait, let's just continue to love him, and let's know that while we wait, he's working, and he's working for our good.
We had a chance to talk about the fact that even in our waiting, God is working. But the hard part to think about is, what do we do in the waiting? You know, I think of the holding pattern even of a plane. As a plane is circling the runway, it's still moving. So we have to make sure that we don't stop moving.
That's
or
right.
else the plane's going to go down.
Yeah.
And the first thing that goes in the period of waiting is our hope. And that is what you cannot do. Don't lose hope. I mean, the verse in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 31 says, "But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength." It says they will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint.
Yeah, Proverbs 12:13 tells us hope deferred makes the heart sick.
Yeah.
And that's a perfect description of the way we often feel sometimes when God has us in this holding pattern. We feel heart sick.
Yeah.
We feel like something's just not right on the soul level because our hopes, our expectations have just not been met.
Yeah, so we need to make sure that we don't stop moving in terms of our hope. But the other thing is stand on the promises God has already said. A lot of times we're so focused on what God is going to say that He's already said something. There's already been a revelation, or He's already given us a promise, or we've already read something in God's Word, and we know what we should be doing, and continue to stand on that until we get the next word of the Lord.
That's good.
But I think of Acts chapter 9, we see a man named Saul, and he has this incredible conversion moment. I mean, Jesus literally knocks him off his high horse, and it's this awesome conversion. But in that moment, God gives him a very specific promise, and it's in verse 15. "But the Lord said to Ananias, 'Go, this man is my chosen instrument,'" this man being Saul, "'to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings and to the people of Israel.'" So right there is this promise for Saul that he would be a chosen instrument to proclaim his name to the Gentiles. So what ends up happening is okay, he receives this promise, so he begins to go out and start to preach, but things aren't going well and people are trying to kill him. But then we find out in verse 30 of chapter 9, when the believers learned of this, they took him down to Caesarea and sent him off to Tarsus. So basically they send him off to Tarsus, and Saul ends up becoming the Apostle Paul. He's this incredible man who's actually written almost half of the New Testament. But what we don't realize is there's actually a period of waiting there. He was actually in Tarsus for almost 10 years.
Yeah.
So he receives this promise, and then all of a sudden he's in this holding pattern. But he begins to stand on that promise. And then we find out in chapter 11 of the book of Acts that Barnabas, in verse 25, it says, "Then Barnabas, after about 10 years later, then Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul." He thought, this is the guy for the job. But meanwhile, Paul, at that time, is just getting ready for what God is going to do and standing on those promises.
Yeah, just holding on to the last thing God said is so important. And another thing to remember when we feel like we're in one of these holding patterns in our faith is just to remember that this is a season of preparation.
Yeah.
While you might feel like you're just kind of going in circles up here, down on the ground, the runway's not ready yet.
Right.
It's just not time. And if you would force God's hand, or you would have your own way and try to make it happen, you could mess things up. And so we have to just remember that this season that I'm in, because we know that God is always working, and because we know that God is always faithful to His word and His promises, we have to know that this is a preparation season.
Right.
I love the story of Nehemiah in the Old Testament. Nehemiah was one of the Hebrew people that had been taken into Babylonian captivity. And while he's there living captive, he's actually serving in the courts of the king. He's the cupbearer, so he's got a good job. But some men came back from Judah, which is where they had been taken from, and he asked them, "Hey, how are things going?" Some of the exiles had already gone back. Right. They had started rebuilding. He wants to know, "Hey, how's it going?" And he gets a pretty negative report.
Right.
He's distraught over the fact that the walls of the city are still in disrepair. And so Nehemiah begins to call out to God in prayer. In fact, in Nehemiah chapter 1, from verse 5 all the way down to the end of that chapter in verse 11, Nehemiah prays this incredible prayer. Now, there's not really anything he can do to fix the situation.
Right.
It's out of his control, but he's not wasting the waiting. Right. He's not doing nothing. He's doing two things, in fact. He's praying and he's preparing.
Right.
And I would just say to us, if we're in a season where we feel like we're just waiting for God to move, You should be praying about it, but you should also be preparing. And so the time comes where the king asked Nehemiah, what are you so upset about?
Yeah.
He asked him, what's going on? You look sad. You don't ever look sad around me. Why are you so sad? And so Nehemiah begins to tell him in the second chapter what's happening. It says in verse 3, I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city of my ancestors are buried, where my ancestors are buried, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? Verse 4 is so important. The king said to me, what is it you want? Now imagine if Nehemiah had spent all of his time just frustrated.
Yeah, sulking.
Just disappointed that the city's in disrepair and that there's nothing he can do about it, and that he feels bad for the people living back in his homeland. But because he spent, and it's been 4 months,
right,
because he spent the last 4 months from the time he heard that report praying and preparing, when this question came, what is it you want? You know what? In Nehemiah, he knew exactly what he wanted.
Yeah.
He had a plan. He knew all the things that needed to come together so that the walls of Jerusalem could be rebuilt. And so as you read the rest of the story, it's so exciting. He begins to ask for these big, audacious, bold requests, and the king grants him the request.
Yeah.
And God goes on to use him to rebuild the walls. But it doesn't happen if in the waiting season, he doesn't recognize that this is a moment for preparation.
Right.
I would just appeal to you, whatever your waiting season might be right now in your life. There are certainly some things that are out of your control. You know, you may be in a situation right now where you have tension in your marriage, and you're praying and saying, God, you gotta fix my spouse.
Right.
You know, God, you gotta do something. And maybe he does need to do something with them. But let me ask you, are you also preparing?
Correct.
Are you planning? Are you making space in your calendar?
Yeah.
Do you have a date night on the calendar? You know, are you doing some things? Or what about in your finances?
Yeah, or
you
your
know,
next job.
Yeah, so often we can be looking at the situation that we want God to intervene and do something. But, you know, when it comes to our finances, have you actually put a budget together? Mm-hmm. You know, do you know what you need? Or are you just saying, God, I need help because the stack of bills are high? Or that job scenario you mentioned. Right. You know, a lot of people have expressed the frustration that they'd like to have a better job or a different career. But let me ask you, have you put a resume together?
Yeah.
You know, have you done what you can do and what you should do? Because right. I don't know who the king will be in your scenario, but somebody has the key that unlocks the door for your future. And they may come with that question that Nehemiah was presented with. What is it you want?
Right.
You know, in the New Testament, James said, we have not because we ask not.
Right.
I heard it said before that sometimes we don't get what we want because we don't know what we want.
Yeah, it's true.
And maybe that's not true for you. Maybe you do know exactly what you want, but want to encourage you with that last thought in the waiting, in the holding pattern. Yes, don't lose your hope, and certainly stand on everything that God has already said, but also recognize that this is a preparation season.
Right.
There's a reason for the waiting, and God's getting ready to open a door and a new avenue for you. Will you be ready to walk through it?